Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, the Jews saying, "Not in my name," in reaction to Israel's attack on Gaza. The atrocity by Hamas on October the 7th, in which more than 1,100 people were killed, many of them civilians, and 250 more taken hostage, has been met with a ferocious response. The Israeli army has killed 32,000 Palestinians, 13,000 of them children, and Gaza now stands on the brink of what UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has described as an entirely man-made disaster. Wherever you stand on the politics of the story, it is undeniably a vast human tragedy, and our thoughts go to all of those suffering in the Middle East at the moment. Israel proclaims itself as the Jewish state, but that doesn't mean that all Jews, or indeed Israelis, agree with its actions. We're going to hear from Emily Hilton. Emily is the UK director of Diapora Alliance, co-founder of NAMOD, British Jews Against Occupation. And Uri Agnon is an Israeli theatre maker and activist, originally from Jerusalem, who wrote a musical about anti-Semitism. Welcome both. I think it's just an appropriate moment with Israel standing, I think, isolated on the world stage to reflect how we got here, how we move forward from here. Emily, what do you make of the current tragic situation in Gaza?
Obviously, it is one of the biggest catastrophes and in many ways, I think one of the biggest moral failings of our time. I think that the way in which Israel has been allowed to essentially have a carte blanche approval from the world to brutally assault Gaza in this way, the fact that Palestinians in Gaza are now starving to death, and there seems to be such little real accountability and pressure put on the Israeli government by the international community in this moment, I think is a total disgrace and has a couple of risks. I think the first one is obviously, and most importantly, the risk to Palestinian life. And we've also seen the way in which Israel is now clamping down on other areas under its control, including in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, against Palestinian citizens of Israel. But the other, I think, casualty of the failure of the international community to really hold Israel accountable for its war crimes against Palestinians is the casualty of international human rights and the international humanitarian law. Because obviously, if Israel is allowed to do whatever it wants with no accountability, why aren't other regimes that commit human rights violations and war crimes allowed to do that as well? It completely flies in the face of the principles that we hold around the idea that all life should be kept sacred and that all humanitarian law or human rights should be respected and upheld. It's a very concerning time, and it really feels like it's reflecting a broader far-right shift that we're seeing in world politics in this moment, and the risks that that's going to have to all people and human rights and civil liberties across the globe.
At the same time, we've seen the UN Security Council in recent days voting for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The US, and this is clearly a significant geopolitical shift, dropping its veto, which it had previously imposed on ceasefire calls. So there is this sense, isn't there, that Israel is being forced to answer for its actions in a way that it hasn't done previously.
I think it's an interesting question. The challenge is whether there will be any material consequences as a result of those resolutions. And I think that is something that we have to be thinking about. The reality is the US, the UK, other countries are still sending weapons to Gaza. So, if the US abstains at the UN, that's great. But then if they're still continuing to send weapons to Israeli military that then bombs Gaza, the same way with the failure to put up pressure Israel to allow humanitarian aid in, we need to make sure that those things like the UN resolution are not simply just symbolic gestures and actually have some weight behind them.
I agree with that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with this horrific Israeli attack on Gaza and the responses in the world is we're seeing the disconnect between discourse and action. Because if you are online, it could look like Israel is losing, right? There's so much pro-Palestinian discourse. You see so many Israelis and pro-Israeli accounts and people talking about how difficult it is right now to be pro-Israeli in all of this, because there's something happening where we see the discourse is being quite clearly against this, and rightfully so. How can someone see these atrocities and not speak out against them? But at the same time, as Emily says, we're not really seeing any of that on the ground. So we have this country that is now speaking as if it is being bullied by the entire world and everyone is against us. And when you read Israeli news and you see Israeli media, this is the frame of thought. Israel, way before this resolution, has been speaking as if the entire world is against it, while at the same time, the entire world continues to fund it and to allow for these atrocities. So there's a complete disconnect between the way people speak and what actually happens. And I think in a way, the Israeli government has realized this and has exploited it. I think they're aware that there's always a lot of speaking against the occupation, for example. So there have been so many resolutions, UN resolutions against the occupation, so many statements put out, but they've always only been statements. And I think the real question is, when and how does this change and shift? And while I agree that the UN resolution is important and could be important, I think the fact that we're seeing sanctions on Israeli settlers for the first time as actually being not less important and perhaps more important, and we don't know where this is heading, but it seems like suddenly there could be some sort of material implications, and that's where things could really actually change.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And I think the sanctions against settlers, as someone, Uri and I have both spent time in the West Bank as part of sort of solidarity presence with Palestinian communities there who are facing daily violence from settlers and Israeli soldiers. And it's a very strange thing to see people that you sort of clocked in the distance all of a sudden on these sanctions lists. Also within that, I think there's a real moment and a reckoning here within that public discourse around not just occupation, but what is the systems in place in Israel that sort of create a structural inequality that goes beyond 67. And I think there's an interesting moment here where these sanctions regimes against individual settlers is used as a way to say, we're doing something, or the US is saying we're doing something, or the UK is doing something, without having to look or face either the humanitarian catastrophe, man-made catastrophe in Gaza, or in terms of having to poke at the sort of more broader structural problems. So it's a balance of, we welcome these sanctions, but it can't be the end point. And I think the work of people working on this issue is to make sure that that is step one rather than the end goal, particularly in relation to how do we create a long-term sustainable future of justice and equality for all people.
Yeah, from 67, for people who may not know, that's a reference to the 1967 Six-Day War, which Israel used as an opportunity to extend its borders and to grow its landmass effectively by occupying the Golan Heights. And Uri, you talk about atrocities, and of course, the world was shocked by what happened on October the 7th. It was truly horrific. The act, according to 44 different nations, of a terrorist organization in Hamas. Israel couldn't not respond to that, could it?
Just to be very clear, the atrocities of October 7th are exactly that. They are horrific atrocities. And as an Israeli, I know people who have been affected by it. And it's quite hard to find Israelis who don't have in their wider circles people who have been kidnapped, killed, or escaped death. And so, yes, these are atrocities. But I think there's a question of where we start the conversation, because it's one thing to say these were horrific atrocities and Israel had to react. But then why are we starting on October 7th? Is October 7th a reaction to something as well? And how far back do we take the clock? And I think at any moment you can stop the clock and say, oh, this side just did this horrific thing. But if we look at a large, at the last 75 years, we see that there's been so much violence and so many horrible things happen. But the party that has had more power within this structure and still has more power is the state of Israel. And so if we're not trying to look only at the past and say, oh, this should have been done this could have been done like that, and definitely lots of things could have been done better by all partners. The people who have the power now and throughout this time is the state of Israel. And so I think looking forward, Israel definitely can act very, very differently to the way that it's acting and has to.
Yeah, my partner's Israeli, and we also both knew people who died on October 7th, and it is totally horrific. But I also think that many of us who've been in this work for a long time, very much, I think what also happened on October 7th was the sort of cracking, the complete breaking of this facade or idea that occupation can keep Israelis safe, keep Jews safe. And that's certainly a conversation that I think is also live in diaspora Jewish, this is also so horrific on that level too. But also, we saw Israeli, particularly, but others saying that, one war crime doesn't justify another. What is happening in Gaza is still unjustifiable. There are other ways to address the horrific reality of what happened on October 7th without what we are witnessing now, which is over 30,000 people being killed, predominantly women and children, forced starvation, allowing of humanitarian aid, which is very hard to not conclude that that is a form of cruel collective punishment. When we see the way in which members of the Israeli government talk about Gaza, that there are no innocents in Gaza, that Gaza must be erased, we can see that this goes beyond what happened on October 7th. And that also, even talking about the hostages, obviously being taken hostages is unacceptable. The people that are trapped in Gaza, both Israelis and Palestinians at this point, are having a horrific time. And it's becoming increasingly clear, and we can see that with the protests in Israel, that the Israeli government doesn't seem to be that focused on rescuing those hostages, even though that seems to be one of the biggest sort of political stories. That doesn't seem to be the priority. And in fact, Israeli political leaders have said it's not the priority in the last 6 months. So I think there is a question here of what is the process of ensuring that we protect the most amount of lives, that we are thinking about the future. And that just does not seem to be the priority of the Israeli government, who, as Uri says, does hold the power in this moment.
I totally agree with all of that. And I would say that it's been very clear from the beginning that the Israeli government is not doing anything in order to bring back the hostages. We have seen so many hostages return with a deal. And when you try to rescue them by force, so to speak, well, they've been much less successful in that. And that makes sense. We all know it. So it's so evidently clear that everything that the Israeli government is doing right now, it's not doing in order to protect the people of the border communities in Israel, and it's not doing in order to bring back the hostages. Even if it were, I don't think I agree that it's justifiable, this amount of death and starvation. You just can't think about it as a means to any end, except for very short-term political strategies for some specific people in Israeli government, and for very long-term political strategies for the extreme right in Israel, who are open about the fact that they want to resettle Gaza with Israelis. So this isn't really about the atrocities that Hamas did and continue to do. It's not related to that in any real sense.
Underlying the conflict is the sense of grievance that Palestinians have about the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, the Nakba, the forced evacuation of Palestinians, and there is a persistent demand for a right of return. Do you think that that call for a right of return can be reconciled with Israel's insistence on its identity as a Jewish state?
For me, from my perspective, I believe very strongly that people should be allowed to live wherever they want. That's true for the UK, that's true for Europe, that's true for the US, and that's true for Jerusalem. And I think that it's undeniable that the Nakba is something that started in 48 and that still goes on, and that if we want to think of any real future on that land, is something that has to be reckoned with. It won't go away in any way. And so, yes, I believe that any future, any just future in that land has to take into account that historic and ongoing disaster, and should see this land as a place for Palestinians and for Jews, and, in my opinion, for anyone who wants to live in that part of the world should be able to live it. And that's the way we should be thinking about now. Whether that means that this current way of thinking about a Jewish state needs to be changed, yeah, probably it does. And personally, I'm okay with that. I don't feel the need for a national state in this sort of sense. And I definitely don't feel the need for such a Jewish state on the expense of so many lives and rights of so many people. That doesn't mean that I don't want that place to be a place where Jews can live and be safe.
At the same time, of course, the Jewish state was created in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and Jonathan Glazer addressed that, didn't he? The Oscar-winning director of The Zone of Interest, when he received his Oscar, and talked about how Israel, in a sense, has used the Holocaust as a cloak to defend its actions in later years. But the reality is that Jewish people have been persecuted across generations, across centuries, across countries. So the creation of the Jewish state for many Jewish people was the opportunity to say, well, here we are, at last we have a place where we can feel safe and where we won't be persecuted.
Yes, it is that for many people, not for everyone. And as we know, the establishment of the Jewish state began before the Holocaust, even if the actual state is very much in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And people wanted that before the Holocaust and continue to want it afterwards. And I think we have to understand that and to respect that and to find a way towards a future that accepts it. But the fact that people want something doesn't necessarily mean that they are entitled to it. I think Jews are entitled to not be persecuted. Absolutely. Are they entitled to not be persecuted on the expense of other people being persecuted? That I am less sold on as an idea. And that is the reality we're living in. It's not on the moon. It's in a specific place where people lived before and where people continue to live. So we can't have that national state on other people's expense, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I'm glad you brought up Jonathan Glazer, because I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. But, I think one of the lessons that I take from the Holocaust, if you can take such lessons, I think there's always a question of whether these kinds of historical moments are instructive. But the important thing for me is that it's the story of when Jewish people were being persecuted, most of the world's nations shut their doors to them, and thousands of people died, including here in the UK. UK society likes to talk a lot about the kinder transport. It doesn't like to talk about the thousands of other Jewish refugees it didn't let in to the country, many of whom perished in the Shoah as a result. And so I think that there's lots of different lessons to take. And I think the question of what keeps Jewish people safe is a very important one. And I think there's a growing movement of Jewish people around the world who don't see Israel as a place that keeps Jewish people safe. I think there are questions as to whether nationalism is the antidote to anti-Semitism. And I think ongoingly and increasingly, more and more people are realizing that it isn't. And therefore, that gives us the space and the imagination to think about what are other forms of Jewish safety or Jewish security in the world. That is a really important question that we should be asking this, including Jewish Israelis as well. And I think that is what we need to hold in this moment, is that what Israel is doing in Gaza isn't keeping us safe. As Uri said, we do not keep ourselves safe by oppressing Palestinians. It's really crucial that we recognize that. And I think the second point about the Nakba, and I agree, I think the Nakba is ongoing. And I think if you spend any time in that land, you see the ways in which the Nakba continues, and that the lack of resolution to that, the injustice of that, affects Palestinian society and Israeli society as well. And as someone whose family were forcibly removed from their homes in Europe, my dad, for example, has had the right to take a German passport as a result of his mother being deported, essentially. If I can have that justice and that sort of restitution, Palestinian families also deserve that too. That's a story, I think, that there's a lot of connection, I think, in some ways between a lot of Jewish and Palestinian experience in that way. And often we are told that these are sort of opposing narratives and opposing stories, but actually I think these are stories of connection and should be stories of solidarity as well.
The starting point for reconciliation, I would suggest, Uri, has to be a recognition of what the Nakba did to Palestinian people. As somebody who grew up in Israel, was it ever discussed in those terms? Was it ever publicly acknowledged?
It is very much the worst hidden secret in Israel, because you see it everywhere you go. You just have to look for it. but it is not something that you learn in school, not really. You learn about the war, but it's all from this everyone wanted to kill us, and then we were so great and we won. That is the narrative. And you don't learn about what actually happened and to whom and how and what continues to happen in our name and by us. And I think we see that also right now. So if you look at Israeli media, the level of hiding is just unbelievable. You don't see Gaza. You don't hear from Palestinians. You don't get to understand the full story of what's actually happening. And I think most Israelis know very little about the Nakba and very little about apartheid and about occupation and about the situation in Gaza. And I think that is definitely a big, big, big part of the problem. But I'm not also sure that once people learn, they immediately change everything. I think Israeli society is in a very, very dark place right now. And it really scares me. And so it feels right now that people are basically saying there was never a Nakba, but we'll do another one. And that is a thing that is actually said by people on the Israeli right and not seen as fringe. People who are seen quite mainstream are saying these things because they are willing to accept all of this violence that Israel is doing as something that is almost to be celebrated. So yes, we definitely have to learn about the past, but I think we need to do more than just learning.
Yeah, I think that's right. Something that has been very saddening to me in the last few months is the way sort of these very sort of Jewish communal establishment institutions turn away from, obviously there was a huge amount of horror and pain about what happened on October 7th. And, you know, many folks in the UK have family in Israel and are connected to that country. You know, we can't pretend that that's not true, but at the same time, the sort of failure, I think, of people who claim to sort of be leaders in the Jewish community to condemn or challenge or even acknowledge the violence and the catastrophe that is unfolding in Gaza has been so upsetting and distressing. And, you know, I think there is very little excuse these days for not knowing. We are in a media saturated environment. The information is there, probably more so than any other point in history, frankly. And unless there is more of a moral reckoning about the reality of Israel, rather than a lot of the stories that we are told in our community or in our youth movements, in our synagogues, etc., it's very concerning for where the sort of the moral clarity of our community will be in a few months. It's a very concerning tipping point at this moment.
At the same time, we know, don't we, that even if October the 7th and the reprisal to it ends up creating more recruits in the long term for Hamas, and I think history suggests it would be folly to believe that the ideas that Hamas can be somehow destroyed by military might, even though that is the intention of the Israeli government. Even if we take that out of the equation, the reality is that there are people, Palestinians, Islamists, who would wish to destroy Israel in its current state and who may indeed be fiercely anti-Semitic. We have to acknowledge that, don't we, when we make these calculations and have these discussions?
Of course, there are very bad Palestinians, just as there are very bad Israelis and very bad people in any society. Yes, there are very bad, or at least people that I strongly disagree with. And there are people there who would want to kill me. And yes, we need to know that. We shouldn't be hiding away from these facts.
And they'd want to kill you, let's be clear, just because you're Jewish.
I think they want to kill me because I'm Israeli. I think they might be more interested in killing my family that still lives in Israel rather than myself. So there definitely is a lot of anti-Semitism that happens around the question of Israel-Palestine. I'm not sure it's a very useful way of thinking about specifically what Palestinians are doing. I think if Palestine was occupied by the Japanese, then they would be anti-Japanese. It's not the same sort of hatred toward Jews that we have in classic anti-Semitism. But yes, there are people there that would want to kill me. And I am not kidding myself thinking otherwise. And I also know, again, that in Israeli society, there are many, many, many people who are very open about wanting to kill Palestinians and who do it. And so is that a problem? It is a problem. But is there a solution for it? I believe there is. And I believe that solution has to be in creating hope. I think the only way that people stop wanting to kill each other is if they have a better option to live a life that is fulfilling and that is a life of dignity, a life of safety and security. And will there still be people who are bad? Yes, there will be bad people in every society. But we know that as the situation becomes more and more hopeless, the chances of people taking the routes that seem to us the most horrific just grow. They just have to. And so that's why, yes, there are bad people in both societies. And yes, that's a problem. We have to keep asking, what is the solution to that problem? Not just, is that a problem?
Yeah, I think here in the UK, there's been a marked increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism since October 7th. And there's a lot of concern about the way in which sort of minority communities in this country, whether they feel safe or not. I think the ways in which that has been reported on by the media and how politicians have talked about this issue and really stoked this divide and rule mentality that suggested there's some sort of existential crisis is incredibly unhelpful and breeding hysteria that is not only makes Jews feel less safe, and it's unacceptable for that, but also that it sort of suggests that our place is not here in the UK, which I think is a very problematic narrative and very dangerous. And we have to make sure that we can have reasonable conversations about this. And again, not only think about hope, but also think, what are the things that keep minority communities safe, including Jewish communities and Muslim communities? How do we make sure that we have mechanisms in place that support those communities, like equalities law, like good communal relations, like a situation where our politicians don't only talk about these issues when it's politically expedient for them or when they want to dunk on the other political party. These are the questions and conversations we should really be having in this moment. We know that in situations where everyone is free and equal and democratic, there is less violence. That's just a historical reality. And that should be a future reality in Israel and Palestine, and it should be a future reality here in the UK too. And I think that is where we need to be focusing our time and our conversation.
Emily, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Uri as well. Thank you. Uri Agnon and Emily Hilton. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline Times podcast. If you want to support our work on the podcast, by the way, please consider taking out a subscription to our fantastic monthly newspaper, the Byline Times, available now on selected newsstands or through a subscription over at bylinetimes.com. The paper has the best of our online offerings and content that you can't read anywhere else as well. This has been a We Bring audio production made in Birmingham by me and Harvey White. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.